A growing number of people are feeling the squeeze. Debt is compounding every day and wages haven't kept up. Real estate, rents, electricity, and food are all rising, yet wages stand still. Many Americans are unable to cope with the pressure and have actually left their hometown, gone to different cities, states, and even completely out of the country. Let's take a closer look. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we're going to look at a very important issue that affects so many individuals, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Quite frankly, too much debt and not enough cash. We have seen everything rising around us, and yet our wages have stayed still for a long period of time. So I'm going to actually give you this one article to start off with, where we're looking into several individuals and their personal stories of leaving the country in order to get away from their debt burden and how that affects them today. And then I want to show you statistically on how many individuals are dealing with a crisis and where has all of this wealth gone? Where has all of the prosperity since the financial crisis actually gone into, because we've heard so much and yet we don't see that. The results are not tangible for so many Americans. So let's get into it right away. Some student borrowers are packing their bags and fleeing from the US to other countries where the cost of living is often lower and debt collectors wield less power over them. Although there is no national data on how many people have left the United States because of their student debt, borrowers tell their stories of doing so in Facebook groups and Reddit channels, and how-to advice is offered on personal finance websites. This is happening. It's a growing trend. Of course, the debt doesn't stop once you leave. It simply compounds, but I believe that these individuals never intend on coming back. This has been something that, because of the growing student debt problem, which has exceeded $1.5 trillion, is part of that. We also have this issue that I once again have to suggest to you, that wages in general have not increased along with some other things. At the bottom here, outstanding student debt in the US has tripled over the last decade and is projected to swell to $2 trillion by 2022. Average debt at graduation is currently around $30,000, up from an inflation-adjusted $16,000 in the early 1990s. Salaries for new bachelor degree recipients, also accounting for inflation, have remained almost flat over the last few decades, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But what I wanted to note here was that in this particular article, they get into the personal issues of several people, but I didn't want to touch on those specifically. But if you want to, this is definitely something to read, because you get to hear about these people's actual individual situations and what they had to deal with. Let's look at the real data, the adjusted average salaries for bachelor degree graduates 1960 to 2015. And I wanted to show you this because it gives you an idea of where salaries have gone. Now, if you go back to 1960, the reported average starting salary was $6,000, okay? Now, if we look at it in today's dollars, rather 2016's dollars, it's $47,000, okay? So that's how it works. But if we take this chart and actually scroll through, you're going to notice something interesting. The reported average starting salary, of course, it grows over time. The actual adjusted salary doesn't. You could see, in fact, sometimes it's $59,000, $58,000, goes down to $50,000, stays around there, and you can see over time in the 80s it's $20,000, $25,000, and so on. But the adjusted doesn't really do so, and in fact, it looks terrible in some years. Like, look at the 90s, it's in the 40,000s range here, and if we go to the newest numbers, it's at $50,000. While expenses on basically everything have risen, the wages have not kept up. You used to have one wage earner in the house that was sufficient to get your car, to get your house paid, to not have a mortgage, to not have to worry about all of these excesses that we do have today. Something doesn't add up. Of course, this is all because of the central bank policies. They're destructive policies, but nobody understands that. The average person doesn't know. They just went to school, or they went to a trade, or they got a job somewhere. They started working, they pay the bills, they wait for that 2 weeks, a year where they can get their vacation, and they rinse and repeat. This is what they know. They don't understand the underlying fundamentals of the financial system, of the monetary system, of how central banking works, and they lose as a result. Wage growth versus real wage growth. Despite the rise in wages, when factoring in inflation, real wage growth has actually fallen 9% since 2006. So you could see this documented proof right here. Throughout the financial crisis and beyond, wages have not done well when you see it in actual real terms. So at the top here, we are looking at this green line. It's showing you the wage growth since 2006. That's 14%. Wow. Fantastic, right? Well, the real wage growth at the bottom, the red line, is actually minus 9.1%. So this is when you start to factor in everything that goes in line with inflation. You start to paint a really different picture. For most US workers, real wages have barely budged in decades. So the statistics are here from Pew Research. If you want to read them for yourself, everything you need to know is in this article. Now it is from 2018, but the points are basically the same. And I just show you this because it's all interconnected. Many people often don't see how these all tie together, but I know that you do, and that's why I'm bringing it to you. Americans' paychecks are bigger than 40 years ago, but their purchasing power has hardly budged. Average hourly wages in the US, seasonally adjusted, and you could see here back in the 60s, $2.50, right? All right, everybody knows, wow, we're getting paid more today, but in fact, it's actually the same thing or less in many cases. This has not increased, yet the prices that we pay for our homes, for electricity, and so on have increased many multiples. But where has that money gone? We've heard about the wealth increase. We've heard that people are doing better today. Well, not everybody. The richest 10% of households now represent 70% of all US wealth. So this is from MarketWatch, and they're actually quoting the Federal Reserve, and I wanted to show you the actual document itself. I always like to give you the documentation directly from the source. This is the Federal Reserve's own website, and I'm pulling up this document. If you want to see the document, link will be in the description so you can get that for yourself. I'm going to show you a series of charts that corresponds to this Federal Reserve document, and it has all kinds of information related to where the money is, all right? And you want to know it's in the top 10%. In fact, as you'll see in this chart and the others I will show you, is that the top 10% has 70% of the wealth. You have to understand how powerful the top 10% really are. Now, the top 10% are not those individuals that you see, the billionaires and so on. We're talking about individuals, high net worth individuals that make more money every single year. This doesn't correspond to what the average person is seeing. In fact, the bottom 50% have almost nothing whatsoever. You have to understand that. Bottom 50% have nothing. That to me is telling a big story. Look at this here. Total assets by wealth percentile group on the top, and then total liabilities by wealth percentile group on the bottom. And as you can see in the top left corner, the top 1%, you could see their growth over time has been much more dramatic than the other groups. If you look at the chart to the top right, as time goes on, the top 1% of people have more wealth every single year. This doesn't change. The average individuals lose more and more and more, while that top 1% group is taking more of the pie. Many people believe that they are in the top 1%. They behave like they're in the top 1%. But once the recession hits, they realize what group they were really in. This is just showing you the net worth by wealth percentile group, essentially the same information. Predicted measures of corporate equity / mutual funds and mortgages. Just wanted to give you this as it relates to the assets that these people own. Obviously, the top 1% owns much of this in percentage terms. So to bring us back into the initial article, we were talking about student debt. We were talking about people literally fleeing the country in order to escape their debt. Millennials are doing far worse financially than generations before them, with student debt, rising rents, and higher healthcare costs pushing the average net worth below $8,000. My goodness, this is very, very telling. The net worth of Americans aged 18 to 35 has dropped 34% since 1996. This demographic is paying more for education and such basics such as food, transportation, while incomes have largely flatlined. So all of this information is in fact correlated, and people need to understand that. The vast majority of consumers are under tremendous financial pressure. That is particularly true for the low-income Americans and millennials. As I showed you, in the bottom 50%, they own almost nothing at all. The growing gap between the nation's wealthiest residents and everybody else is affecting the way that consumers spend. Education expenses have climbed 65% in the past decade. Food costs have jumped 26%. Healthcare is up 21%. Housing is up 16%. Transportation 11%. And all the while, wages have been flat. They have been completely flat this entire time. So obviously there is an issue here when these two are not growing together. Sure, you could have inflation in assets, and it's not really a reasonable problem when you have wages and the actual expenses going together, because essentially they cancel each other out. But in this case here, you have a divergence. You have one going like this, one going like this, and over time it gets worse and worse. This has become a big issue for a lot of people, not just millennials, but they are definitely feeling it the most. Healthcare costs top financial problem for US families. This is out of Gallup, and you can see 17% name healthcare in response to this open-ended question. What is exactly your biggest concern? Lack of money or low wages? Only other issue mentioned by at least 10%. So this is a problem here where you have people paying extremely high rates for their healthcare. Many individuals do not expect something to happen, and then they find, in fact, it does. It does happen because over and over again, we are finding ourselves in some sort of emergency. And that is unfortunate, but it does happen. It will happen. So we need to be prepared. That's why we should take control today. Do what we can. We must make sacrifices today sometimes, and we need to push as hard as we can to be able to maintain the status of the average ordinary citizen. In fact, wasn't the case many decades ago, but this is where we're at. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up. When you give me a like on this video, you are supporting me and this channel, so I do appreciate that very much. If you want the financial education you were not taught in school, these two books have everything that you need from top to bottom, A to Z. You can get all the details. If you want to get the audiobook instead, you can get that at themoneygps.com. If you want to know what's going on in the economy, you need to watch this video here. I'm going to drop that video, so click on it and I will see you there.